Hey guys, hi, welcome back once again. My name is Vaishali, and today I'd like to once again talk about courage, or rather, the story and the interpretation of our nervous system with regards to the story of courage. So, a primitive primal nervous system, our brain, is designed for aversion to loss, and thereby, quite naturally, an aversion to risk taking as well because risk taking entails some kind of a loss. And risk taking is also a part of developing courage. Now, since its primitive design is towards aversion to loss or avoiding losses, and since it's also the organ that consumes the maximum amount of energy on an everyday basis, quite naturally, it goes back to what it has always done. It goes back to what it is habituated to doing, to the familiar. Because doing the familiar, because doing what it is habituated to doing for so long entails that it's trying to reserve and conserve that energy which it can use for its survival, for the survival of the organism. And thereby, from that point of view, courage seems to be counterintuitive, for it demands responsiveness and not reactivity. While the story of fear to some extent has its merits, it helps us stay guarded. It helps us protect ourselves. It helps us be a little more vigilant towards threats. The story of courage begins with the inclusion of honesty, of openness, of trust, of vulnerability, of risk taking, and of facing our fears. And personally, for me, like many of us, it has been faced, it has been dived into at many levels. And that doesn't necessarily mean that I or we have overcome our fears. It just means that we have learned to sit with them, that we have learned to stand with them, that we have learned to walk with them. And when I say many levels, it has been right from taking that needle shot, which to me personally feels like a stab of a knife or a stab of an arrow, and that to many might feel like an over exaggeration. But personally, for me, it's not. For me, it's about realizing that I fear this particular thing. For me, it's about opening up to the person who's going to give me that stab, to be able to vulnerably express my fears that I fear this thing. So be gentle with me, and then to trusting that the prick that they'll give me will not feel like a stab. To being unapologetically honest, wherein I had to take the risk of probably losing some relationships or disassembling some of those relationships or some equations of those relationships to reassembling those relationships or those dynamics or those equations again, like my marriage, with newer equations, with newer understandings, with newer boundaries, which was, of course, challenging in the beginning because disassembling and reassembling can actually look like a car's complete breakdown, wherein every part of the car has been disassembled, has been removed, and thereby it doesn't look like the original car that it was. And the process of disassembling actually involves our honest, our open recognition that the car was no longer functioning the way it needed to function. The car had not been attended to the way it needed to be attended to, which either meant that the car had overworked or underworked without attendance, without maintenance, the way it needed to. The parts that formed and informed the car about the way that it needed to function were out of alignment. And then, after all the parts were removed and the parts only looked like parts and not the car itself, they had to be reassembled again, which of course comes with the understanding that just like Rome wasn't built in a day, this car would also take time to reassemble, that some parts may be lost, that some parts may need to be replaced. The realization that it needs its team members, that it needs its support system to realign differently to make it into a better functioning car. To even honestly, openly, vulnerably facing the reality that my relationship with my daughter at one point in time had become very controlling. that I had become very controlling, that I was even becoming a control freak or a scary creature in her eyes, which I was despising about myself, to rebuilding it, wherein she and I could trust each other more, wherein I could trust rather myself a little more, to trust her a little more, wherein I could create a space for her wherein she felt that she wanted to reconnect with me in an open, honest, vulnerable, trustworthy way. And through our interactions and through her reactions, I could gauge that it was my job to create that space for her, that it was my job to relinquish that control, that it was my job to let go of that control. Because as much as we like the idea of control, we only control things that we don't trust. And that's not necessarily at the exclusion of ourselves. And as much as we all like the idea of freedom, just like the little child who comes out of the mother's comfortable, warm womb into the free, open space, cries out hard because that warmth, safe space no longer exists. Cries out hard because as the lung expands with the inflow, the gush of the air, it hurts. And that pain and that hurt and that wide open space feels scary. So, just like that, in the beginning, independence or freedom can equally feel scary, can equally feel like too much of responsibility. And the natural reaction would be to go back into the comfort, into the warmth of the mother's womb, essentially implying that at that point in time, dependency can feel like a safe structure. Having no independence with a lot of freedom can actually counterintuitively feel like freedom because there's no responsibility. And then, after a while, when one starts to habituate themselves into independence, to even realizing that one is becoming hyper independent, wherein again one doesn't trust anybody apart from themselves. That even at one point in time, I had started having difficulty asking for help. That I was afraid of getting dependent again, to losing my independence again, wherein I had failed to realize that in between dependency and independency or hyper independency, there's a beautiful space of interdependency. And since it's interdependency, or rather what I'd like to call as healthy interdependency, it again requires one to be attentive. It again requires one to be present. It again requires one to be vulnerable, to be trusting, to be open, to be honest, to be able to negotiate our boundaries, and probably even face the risk of all of those aspects being violated, not only by the other but also by ourselves, because we are all creatures of habits. Unconsciously, we all slip back to what is habitual, to what is familiar. And courage is not just having, but even gradually developing the ability to walk with our discomforts, to walk in the unfamiliar, to not just face our fears, to not just walk through our fears, but to walk with our fears. Because for me, fears are our pathways when addressed, leads to the assembly and assemblage of courage through trust, openness, honesty, vulnerability, risk taking. So then, can we treat fear as a friend rather than as an enemy that we need to run away from? Can we treat it as a friend who's just doing his job mostly in a reactive way and not in a responsive way? We'll probably even understand that it's also wanting to walk with us, to feeling more free, to feeling more connected within and outside. Let's try and reflect on all of those aspects, and I will see you once again the next week. Till then, stay tuned in. And guys, if you do like the contextual content of these videos, please do like, share, and subscribe.